So today we're going to be doing a Panto in basic, and I'm going to be showing you how to progress down the quilt. But what I wanted to show you to start out with is something that I get a lot of questions about. What if your quilt isn't square? We should be able to tell that this quilt is not square. It's square to about this point, at which point it does bow way out. The measurement is just over a ½ inch wider in the center of the quilt than it is at the top. So instead of doing what I've showed you in previous videos where I'm going to take the hopping foot and take the right side of the hopping foot and put it on the left side of this quilt up here, I'm actually going to measure down here where it's longer. It is straight on the right hand side of my frame and bowed on the left hand side. So I'm going to use the right hand side to do my first alignment. So let's talk about the nesting of the quilt and then we'll get into the placement. So now I want you to look at the nesting for this pantograph. If you look at the bottom of the frame, it's going to tell you that I'm set up to nest width. And what that means is that it's taken the 4 repeats for this row and evenly spaced them between the 2 edges of the quilt. Typically when we're doing edge-to-edge quilting, we actually want this to be joined so it's a continuous line from one edge to another. So the way that I'm going to get it to do that is I'm going to hit the nest button once. When I hit it once, it's actually set to net fit, and that has made it a continuous row. In this case, there's going to be a big space over here that's not going to be quilted, and I'm going to want it to put a partial on the edge so that I can actually get that quilted. So I'm going to hit it one more time, and that's going to change it to nest ends. So nest ends is going to make it continuous from one edge of the quilt to the other, and if you need the partial rows, it will also put that in for you. The other 2 buttons that we need to talk about on the nest feature is the center button, which is your net center button. It says equal center on the bottom. And what this one is going to do is actually equally space your motifs across the area. And you'll see that they are still not joined together. When you're using equal centered, you can actually also use the size buttons and grow out horizontally, which normally you could not do. It'll let you lock your aspects so that it grows in both directions. So then if I actually make it bigger instead of smaller, like I just did, you'll see that I can get them closer together to where they actually nest. The last button to talk about in the nest column is equal edges, which is the bottom one. And you can see it's got these red lines. Those are the confines on the outside of the quilt. When you use equal edges, it's going to not let things wrap over the ends of the quilt and come out over here, which is how you get your partial rows. When you're using equal center, which is right above it, it's going to center, and you're going to see some partial rows in there when it does that. So the difference between these 2 buttons, they're going to equally space them across the quilt. The middle one will let things wrap if it needs to. The bottom one will not. So I've changed back to nest ends, and we're going to talk about the button on the bottom here with the star and the 2 red lines. This is your vertical wrap button. What it lets you do is decide whether or not you're going to actually quilt these little pink lines on the edge. Sometimes getting it to stretch over so that you can see the lines will actually make it so you don't really actually need to quilt them. In this case, I would, because that's actually probably going to go in about 2 inches. But let's say we didn't want to. We would, if you hit this once, this is a full repeat. These are actually the only 2 full repeats that are showing on the quilt. The one on the right and the one on the left have both been cut off to bring the pink partial rows on to either side of the quilt. When I hit it one more time, it's going to show you without the partials at all. So if it's in this first position here, this is where I would want it if I didn't want to quilt the partials. And if I want to quilt the partials, I would leave it in the center. Now I want to talk about the fit button. With the fit button checked, it is keeping your design within the boundaries of this top and bottom part of the quilt. So I can grow the quilt and the actual design will stay inside the boundaries, inside the quilt top. If I want them to stretch over the quilt top so that this little motif will then end up here, I would take the fit button off, and you can see it popped up a little bit. I can continue to grow it to get it to the spacing that I want it to be. And we also have a horizontal fit button. It's going to work like the vertical fit button. Sometimes when you grow your designs so that they will wrap around over to the other side of the quilt, you don't actually need to quilt that information. If it's going to be less than 1/4 inch or it's not going to show outside of the binding, I will actually take the little dot off of that one, and then it won't quilt those repeats. So if you need the repeat to quilt, you leave the dot on there. If you don't want the repeat to quilt, you take it off. At this point, we've set our quilt up to quilt. We have the nesting where we want it. We have our vertical wrap and a horizontal wrap where we want it. We've resized the pano to a point where we're happy with it and we like the way it looks. So we're ready to quilt. We're going to hit quilt as row and it's going to send it to quilt motion. Depending on how big your quilt is and how much data has to be calculated by the program, it can take several minutes for it to transfer. On this quilt, the center of our quilt is about 1/2 inch wider than the top of the quilt. So I am taking care of all of that on the left hand side of the quilt. I'm still going to set the right hand side the same way I would normally align my quilts. Typically I will do that by taking the left side of my hopping foot and putting it just inside the side of my quilt top. I do the same thing with the front of my hopping foot. It's actually sitting inside the top of the quilt as well. My needle is just off the quilt top in both directions. Now that I have my long arm where I want it to be, I'm going to hit this top right flag button. What the flag buttons do, they're your anchors. So I can hit either one of these, any of the 3 flag buttons, and it's going to align to where I'm telling it. This would be the top left of the quilt, the center of the quilt, or the top right of the quilt. I will typically use the top right of the quilt because I quilt from left to right, and if I know where it's going to stop on the right, as long as it starts off the quilt on the left, I know it's going to be okay. The 2 buttons in between the flag buttons are skew buttons. So let's say that this quilt is actually going up. I can move my long arm, and I'm moving it way up just to show you. And if I hit the skew button, it's going to actually make the quilt a diagonal. You would not want to do anything that was that dramatic on the quilt. You would typically only do that if it was just a little bit off. Right now, my quilt is actually pretty straight loaded on there, so I'm not going to use the skew buttons in this case. So you see all these little light blue dots. Every one of those is a jump stitch, which means it's not going to sew in that area. It's going to pull thread from one point to the other. I really don't want it to do that. I want it to go ahead and just sew a straight line there. So I'm going to hit the optimize button up here on the top, and then I'm going to tell it to remove all. I do not want to connect my first and last point. It will put a big diagonal line across if I do that. So I'm going to say no. And you can see that it's actually put a line in. Now, I know that this quilt at the top is shorter than it is in the middle. So you see this diagonal line right here? Many times I would try to actually to fix that. I would either leave the jump stitch in that one place or possibly be able to reverse some things to get it to start in a different place so it wouldn't be there. In this case, I'm not concerned about it because I do know that that's going to be quilting on the batting right now with as wide as the center of the quilt is. Now that we have set the top right point and we have optimized out all the jump stitches, we need it to move to the start point. I will typically move my long arm so that it is closer to where the start point is and then tell Quilt Path to move it to the start point. There are 2 ways you can move the long arm to start point. You can go under the toolbox and choose move to start point, or you can go to pull bobbin and the long arm will move to where the start point is going to be. You can see that it wants me to step through something when I do pull bobbin. I actually don't step through anything. I will needle down, needle up, scoop my thread out from underneath my foot, and keep going. To me, this is too slow. It takes more time than it does for me just to do it traditionally. Okay, so you can see how far this foot went off of the edge of the quilt. It is sitting at the move to start point. It's actually sitting on its start point. It's somewhere between a half and an inch off of the edge of the quilt, but when I come straight down, you can see it's going to hit right off the edge of the quilt when it comes to the part that's bowing. Let me show you how I scoop the thread out from underneath the foot. I'm going to do a needle down, needle up, take my thread so that I have thread between my finger and just slide it right under the foot. And that's as easy as it is. I have the bobbin thread and I'm ready to go. So now we're ready to hit sew. And we're going to let this sew across the quilt and then we'll be right back with you. So now we're finished with the row. Quilt Path is going to tell us that we're finished with the row. We're going to hit the finished row button. There we go. What you're seeing now is the partial row. Quilt Path will quilt the large row first, the first complete row. Then it's going to go up and quilt the partial row. That's actually the same way that most people pantograph quilt. When they lay out their paper pantographs, they quilt the first row to stabilize and then go and do the fill-in row at the end. So it's actually doing it the way that most of my friends that pantograph quilt. It's going to tell me that we are okay to quilt this. It's in our safe area. So we're going to say, okay, we don't need to do a placement. So Quilt Path is actually ready to go. Once again, I don't want to have the jump stitches. Remember, we did that just a moment ago. So I'm going to optimize those jump stitches out, hit remove all. Say, no, I don't want to connect the first and last point, although this time it would just be a really long line. And then I'm going to say, okay. Okay. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm down at the right end of my frame. I'm going to actually reverse my stitching, let it stitch backwards from the right to the left. It's ready to go. The needle is still where it was. I have not done anything to it. I'm going to go ahead and let it do a jump stitch. I'm going to hit sew right here and let it jump stitch to the next stitch and just keep right on going. So we finished quilting that partial row. Now I'm going to hit finished row again. And you can see this time it's telling me that the pattern is not within the safe area. And I'm going to need to scroll the fabric. We would call that advance the fabric, but that's okay. We're going to say, okay, I believe you. It's having a little bit of problems with my stylus. And we're ready to do the next row. Notice you have some options here. You can choose to move to the top left, move to the top center, or move to the top right. You can actually do one or two or all three of these options. I will typically set on the top right. You can also hear, possibly from my long arm, that my carriage is still engaged. So right now I can't move my long arm at all. Because I'm going to move it to the top right and I've ended at the top left, I'm going to use the toolbox button, and I'm going to release my carriage. That's going to let me end my stitching before I move it. Since I released the carriage, I can now move it by hand to the top right of the quilt. So I'm going to hit the move to top right button. That is going to move the entire long arm down to the top right corner of this next row. So by magic, the long arm is going to move down here. And it is kind of close in there, but it's going to be okay. I'm actually going to take this orange tape. It's just masking tape. I buy it in lots of different colors so that I can see it on the quilt top. In this case, orange is going to be a good color. It's not a color that's in this quilt. And I'm going to sneak this down in here and try to get it onto the quilt in such a way that it's not going to be quilted over in a minute. Then I'm going to use my needle up down feature on my long arm to punch a hole through that tape. Once I get the hole punched, I can then come back up to quilt path and hit the continue with placement button. It's going to ask me, are you sure you've marked the fabric and are ready to proceed? Yes, I am. And then it releases my carriage so I can remove my long arm again. Now we're going to scroll the quilt. We're going to advance the quilt so that we get our orange tape up towards the leveler bar on our long arm so that we're ready to make the next pass. And we'll show you that in just a moment. So I've advanced the quilt. You can see the tape that I just did, and I punched the hole through, and I've sewn the edges of the quilt down. I did that on both sides of the quilt. I'm now ready to tell quilt path, this is where the top right corner of my design is. So I'm going to move my long arm over, and I will use the flywheel on the left side of the long arm to sneak my needle down into the hole. This is my flywheel. I am going to move my flywheel from the bottom to the top, and this will make my hook move in the proper rotation. And this one may be a little bit hard to see. I have done the needle down in the hole. And once I do that, I will step away from my machine so that I am not putting any pressure up here on this belly bar. I want you to see what happens when I lean on the machine. You can see the whole thing move. So I want to step away from my machine before I do my alignment mark. Now I'm going to hit my corner placement anchor mark. And I'm going to do optimize again to get rid of the blue dots. So optimize, remove all, no, okay. And we're ready to move to our start point again. Okay, we're at the end of the row again. We're going to hit finished row. It's going to calculate where the row is. It's going to tell me it's outside of my safe area. And we're going to say, okay, sure enough, it's outside of my safe area. I'm going to go ahead and hit the toolbox again, release my carriage because I want to pull my bobbin up. So I'm going to do that real quick. I'm going to actually push the tape back down. It had moved a little bit, but I want to keep that tape on until I'm done with the quilt in case I need to go back to that row for some reason. Now I'm going to tell it to move to top right. It's going to move to the top right of the next row again. Slide my handy dandy orange painter's tape underneath my foot. And I now know I probably need it more over here just from the way the last one did. See if we can get it without it peeling it up this time. I'm going to needle down through it, needle up, then I'm going to hit my continue placement. Am I sure that I did this right? Yes, I am. I'm sliding my finger instead of touching it. And then I'm ready to scroll the quilt again. So I snuck my needle back down through the hole using the flywheel. And now if I pan up, I'm ready to hit my right hand anchor flag. And then once again, we're going to hit optimize, remove all, and say no. And I'm going to say, okay. Now I want to know about how far that bottom is going to go. And I'm going to do that by using these bottom 4 buttons here. The outside 2 will move the bottom corner out on the y-axis, so it's going to move it to the right and to the left. The one with the arrows going both direction will actually pull your corners so that they move it up and down or back and forth on the long arm towards the leveler bar and towards the belly bar, and also to the right and to the left. I want to see how far this bottom right corner is from where Quilt Path thinks it is. So I'm going to put my long arm on the bottom right corner. And once again, I will pan up to Quilt Path. And I'm going to hit the bottom right skew button in both directions. It did move quilt down just a little bit, so the design is a little bit longer than I was intending it to be. I have a feeling it would actually hit right on the stitch line. I'm going to check that real quick. And sure enough, it will. So I did a really good job entering the length of this quilt. It is exactly the length that I need it to be. I'm going to check out both corners that way though. So I'm down at the bottom left-hand side of my quilt, and I have my long arm positioned where I want it to go. So I'm going to pan up to Quilt Path again and hit the bottom left-hand skew button. And what I want you to notice is that it has dropped down a lot on this side. It's probably half an inch longer on this one corner than it is on the other one. In this case, I'm going to want to keep that. I'm going to let it go ahead and stretch this last row just a tiny little bit so that it'll cover the entire quilt. I'm going to march Quilt Path down, or march my long arm down to the other end of the quilt and try to get it pretty close to the same length so that it looks right when the quilt gets done. So I am actually going to play with this so that it visually looks correct on my screen. One of the things I want you to notice is that I have a grid showing behind my quilt motion. You can get your grid to show by going to Options and having a check in the Show Grid option. So I do have that check. We're going to say OK. And I'm going to use this so that on my screen, I can get it to where this bottom line looks pretty straight. So I'm going to pull this down. I'm going to move my long arm, and I'm going to use this grid, and I'm really going to watch my screen and not where the long arm is to try to get this corner to be even with that one. So I'm going to use that grid line going across and this bottom right-hand skew button to pull it down. You can see I've pulled it in too. I don't really want to do that, so I'm going to sneak out just a little bit and push it again. And that makes the bottom line pretty straight and this right-hand side straight as well. So I'm happy with the way it looks, and I'm going to go ahead and quilt. So we're going to hit finished row again. And this time we have the partial row at the bottom, so I'm going to say OK. So in this case, I don't really need to do the partial row. Here's the stitching line for my last row. My partial row is going to come and do this. It's actually not even going to quilt on the quilt. So if you were to finish that very last row and you hit finished row at the end of it, you're actually going to get what is called the top row spacing window. This will come up at the end of every quilt that you quilt all the rows on. What this is used to do is tell Quilt Path how far it is from the bottom of this quilt top to the top of the next quilt top. If you're loading quilts in tandem, you can actually have Quilt Path continue the same design and quilt it again This is useful for things like when you're quilting a lot of table runners that are all identical and you want to get them done, you can have just quilt them one right after another. Once you've done the optimization on the first quilt, it will hold for the second quilt, so you don't even have to optimize each row on the second quilt.